Hi, a game between Nakamura and Carlsen, a bullet game, a pretty interesting game with some interesting things happening both in the opening and in the middle game and in the end game. Nakamura starts with e4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, f4. This is an interesting move, but it feels like King's Indian that is played by white. But the drawback of this move is that it creates some weaknesses on the king side. e6, knight f3, but overall f4 is definitely possible. a6, d4. This is a move that I would not feel easy about making, since I would rather prefer making a move like d3, d6, bishop e2, knight f6, since after massive exchange in the center, after d4, it would feel that white would start feeling the weaknesses that are created after playing f4. So d4 was played actually in the game. C takes d4, knight takes d4, queen c7. Now black maybe has a threat of capturing on, it's not a threat, but it's a possibility of capturing on d4. For example, knight d4, queen d4, bishop c5, queen d3, d6, and it feels like black's dark squared bishop is pretty strong. White plays, Nakamura plays knight b3. He probably doesn't want black to have this option, and he doesn't want black to have this powerful dark squared bishop f. Knight f6, bishop d3, b5, e5 is played, and Carlsen answers with b4. Instead, if he played knight g8, it would be much more passive move, and it would be knight e4, d6, he takes d6, bishop d6, knight d6, queen takes d6, and black's pieces are pretty passive. So instead, Carlsen goes for much more aggressive, much more ambitious move b4, which is a correct move. And at this moment, white plays knight e4, Nakamura plays knight e4. There are going to be some exchanges in the center. Knight e4, bishop takes e4, bishop b7, castle, knight e7, bishop takes b7, queen b7, and I think that I honestly like white's position at this moment. However, it might be true that in reality it's black's position that is better, but I would prefer to play white at this position. I would go for queen d3, bishop e3, rook a to d1, f5, maybe knight c5 at some moment, probably king h1, and it's a bit more natural for me to play this position for white. However, black also has some chances of playing this position. Some good chances of playing this position. Black would play knight d5, black would play bishop e7, black would play castle. This is possible. Probably black would play knight f5 in order to stop this pawn f from advancing. So Nakamura goes for bishop e3. Carlsen answers with knight f5, which is the most natural move to make, and this move actually stops f pawn. The pawn f is stopped, and now Nakamura has to play either bishop f2 or queen d3 or rook e1, but rook e1 doesn't look great. And there is also something that I have to keep in mind, and that is that there is actually an option for black to play actually knight h4, attacking g2 pawn and threatening to create a checkmate on g2. So this is something that white has to keep in mind. I think that bishop f2, what is good about bishop f2 is that bishop f2 prevents this move knight h4. So bishop f2 was actually made in the game, h5 is played. Somehow it feels like Magnus doesn't need to make a castle. Maybe he has an option of playing maybe rook d8, or maybe he would want now to go for rook g8 and then g5, and then he has this very strong queen bishop, essentially queen that stands on the place of the bishop that shoots, that targets g2 square. When d3 is played, Magnus answers bishop e7, rook d1, rook c8. Carlsen goes for rook c8. Now rook d2 is played, castle. Okay. So instead of now rook f2 d1 is played. If now white captures on d7, then rook d7, rook d7 would follow, rook c2, rook e2, rook c2, and now maybe rook d1, and it feels like a good position for black. Instead, white goes for rook f2 d1, and now rook c7 is played. Instead, computer tells that black had a very interesting and very powerful move, which led actually to Carlsen's advantage, and the move was d5. d5 is a very unexpected move, and after en passant capture on d6, it takes d6, bishop d6, actually there is a very interesting idea, and this idea is that f4 pawn is attacked, and strangely enough, it's impossible to defend the f4 pawn. It's at least very difficult, since queen e4 impossible, queen d4 impossible, queen c4 impossible, and the threat of bishop f4 is strangely enough real. So if white now goes for something like g3, it creates a lot of weaknesses. But if white makes a much more natural move, bishop e3, then computer finds a very interesting solution of bishop b8, and all pieces of white pieces don't feel well now. There is a threat of knight e3, queen e3, bishop a7, winning at least an exchange. And there are a lot of threats. If now bishop goes to f2, then bishop f4 naturally, and this position is pretty unpleasant for white to play. Okay, but Carlsen missed this opportunity. It was a very subtle option. Instead, he plays rook c7, queen e2, rook f2, queen e2, rook f2 c8, queen takes h5, rook takes c5. There is an exchange of the pawns now, but it definitely feels like black's position is at least not worse, since there are all kinds of mating threats on g2 square, and black's rooks are more active. Rook takes d7, queen e4, rooks d2, queen f4. Now Carlsen grabs a pawn back. The equality there is, in terms of material, it's an equality, but in terms of position, black's position is preferable. Queen goes back to e2, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, a5, g3, queen g5, knight takes a5, rook c1, rook d1, queen d1, and in this position, which is excellent for Magnus Carlsen makes a very subtle mistake. This mistake is not easy to exploit, but it actually might be that this is actually a losing mistake. Magnus Carlsen makes a move, knight e3. So now maybe you would want to pause the video for a couple of seconds and think how it is possible for white actually to go for a win from this position. From a borderline losing position, white actually might go for a win in this situation. And the hint is that white has one pretty significant strength in this position, and this strength is the passing a pawn, which might march directly to a8 square and to promote to a queen. And the move that Nakamura made is actually queen d2. Queen d2, it's not a win of a piece. The knight is not pinned, since the queen g5 is actually defended by the bishop. So move knight d5 is possible, and this move does not lose a piece. So you would say, so what's the point? How come that actually white might be winning something? But the problem is that black has weak pawns. If black plays knight d5, then if black plays knight d5, then what would follow would be queen g5, bishop g5, and probably bishop c5. And I think that the problem is that it's very difficult for black to defend against against march of a pawn. For example, in this variant, bishop is trapped after knight c4, and if something like bishop c1, then I think that a4, capture on a3, capture on a3, and white has a good pawn. So it's a far cry from having a won position, but this pawn is strong. At least computer evaluates this position as nearly won for white. That's it. And instead, maybe Nakamura actually had to move to d5, but in the game Nakamura played knight g4, and the same ideas followed, but the difference is that knight is more distant, so it shouldn't be good for black. Queen g5, bishop g5, bishop d4 for Carlsen. Actually, I'm sorry, for Carlsen. Bishop d4 is played, and bishop d4 defends e5 square, and now there is a threat of playing knight c6 and capturing on b4, and then playing knight c6 and playing a4, b takes a3, b takes a3, and pawn a is actually marching forward. Bishop d4, bishop e3, Carlsen answers with bishop e3, b takes e3, knight e3, knight c6, and in this position, I note, pay attention to the fact that white has passing pawn a, and at the same time white has passing pawn h. Probable white might create a passing pawn h, playing g4, h4, g5, h5, h6. So this position seems dangerous to black, especially due to the fact that white has a pawn. Knight d5, a4, b takes a3, b takes a3, king f8, a4, king a8, a5, king d7. So it already doesn't seem like such a winning position, but this position is very sharp. Though it has to be calculated precisely at every move, since pawn a is very powerful. Knight d4, knight b4, knight f2. Nakamura blunders a pawn. He instead had to make a move king g2, and if knight d3, then a6, king c7, a7, knight b3, and at this moment there is a beautiful move, knight c6, defending all pawns, and it's impossible to capture the knight. It's impossible to capture the knight, and white has a significant advantage now, so it's difficult to play. White would play king f3, king e4, g4, h4, g5, h5 to march the h pawn and maybe to attack the pawns on the king side. But instead Nakamura blundered a pawn and played king f2, so now what black can do is to play knight d3, what was actually played in the game, king e3, knight e5, a6, king c7, king e4, king c4. It's still, the position is probably still complicated, but if now a pawn falls, then black's position is going to be better. But I'm sure that a draw, it should be at least a draw. White should have at least a draw. Knight f3, knight d6, king e5, f6, king e6. So it seems like there was a blunder, but it also might be that the position was objectively lost already. So Carlsen resided in this position, so he gave this endgame, this dangerous endgame, and this a pawn actually ended the game. But definitely there were some mistakes over there. Maybe, I'm not sure that even at the end it's really losing for black. Okay, thank you for watching.